and begins to train water magic until suddenly he is transported to a mysterious place. And then he is approached by a being who reassures him by saying that they are not in the afterlife. Having said that, he addresses the boy calling him Madara Ryou and reveals that he ended up dying after a car accident. Upon hearing this, Ryou remembers this fact and asks if that being is a god. At this, the creature claims to not be a god, but a simple angel. And as the conversation progresses, Ryou understands that he will be reincarnated in a new world. However, he still doesn't know exactly what he will do in this unknown place. In this, the angel leaves him free to do whatever he doesn't understand in this new world. After all, he wasn't assigned to the place to do anything. Upon hearing this, Ryou decides that he will live peacefully, seeking only happiness in this new world that he is about to go to. And in the meantime, the angel continues to explain to him how the world will work, and says that the place is called Phi and will have magic. However, only 20% of humans can use it. As for Ryou, the angel informs him that he has an aptitude for water magic, but since his goal is to have a peaceful life, the angel decides to send him to the Rondo Forest, and in addition, he will also grant Ryou a house and supplies for 2 months. And upon arriving at the place, Ryou finds a book on the table where there are several species of monsters, so that he can get to know better the creatures of the new world where he lives. And even realizing that the alphabet is different, Ryou is amazed to see that he is able to read those scriptures. And as for water magic, Ryou can master it without even saying anything, just by imagining the shape of the water in his hand. And although this speeds things up, Ryou is annoyed, as he liked having to repeat the intonations to make the water appear. And well, when trying to fill a bathtub with his water magic, Ryou realizes that he is only able to summon water at room temperature, something that leaves him disappointed. And when trying to make ice, Ryou faces a new problem, as he is also unable to control water magic to that extent. So, Ryou gets it into his head that he needs to find a way to figure out how to make ice, because that way, he will be able to use a magic like Ice Spear. So, Ryou tries a little harder, visualizing the water molecules molding themselves into a solid state. And finally, Ryou manages to freeze the water in the bucket completely, something that already makes him happy. But Ryou decides to go further, imagining a shape for that huge block of ice. Then, he takes a piece of ice in the shape of a sphere and aims the ice at the sun, thus managing to retain the sun's heat in the ice to make a fire more easily. And as night falls, Ryou feels that he has had a very productive day in this new world, even though it was his first. And after thinking a little more, Ryou deduces that if he applies the same logic that made him able to have ice, he will also be able to produce hot water. With that said, he leaves the bath and heads to the kitchen to make something to eat. And during the meal, Ryou remembers that he will only have supplies for 2 months, which means he should start hunting soon. And since he only has a simple knife, Ryou deduces that he will need to master some attack magic. Therefore, to guarantee his safe and peaceful life, he will need to train to be able to defend himself. With that, Ryou leaves home and begins to train the water ball magic to be able to attack the possible enemies that appear in his path. And after practicing a little, Ryou manages to throw his first water ball and celebrates this new achievement. However, he realizes that this attack will still not be very effective, since it is very weak. At this, Ryou becomes slightly upset, but since he already senses that this could happen, he doesn't let himself get to shaken. Furthermore, Ryou remembers that he can use the water jet, an attack much more effective than the water ball he just launched. But when trying to use this new magic, Ryou shoots a weak jet of water from his hands, and then falls to the ground hopelessly. At this, he remembers the conversation he had with the angel about how to use magic, and the angel at the time only said that he should use his imagination. In this case, he needs to have a clear image of what he wants, and that way, the magic will be fired naturally. And as he trains, Ryou feels his magic improving a little, and then he manages to make hot water, using the opposite logic of ice production. And well, the next day, Ryou begins to train producing ice in the air, and although the process of this is very slow, he manages to succeed in his attempt to create ice in the air. And after passing this first stage, Ryou tries to throw the ice forward. However, the ice flies only a few meters away from him, and soon falls to the ground. At this point, Ryou realizes that all of his current abilities will be useless in a real battle context, since in addition to taking a long time to create ice, he still doesn't gain enough speed to generate damage, which makes his magic useless. And so, Ryou feels that he will need to train his magic more until he perfects it enough to be used in a battle context. After training exhaustively, Ryou falls to the ground feeling like he's about to faint, and then deduces that this is the feeling that occurs when one is low on mana. And after a few days, Ryou manages to at least generate ice in the air more quickly. However, he still can't throw it very far. And moving on, Ryou finds quartz in the forest, and decides to keep the ore to be able to make fire more easily. During his exploration, Ryou ends up finding a wild boar in the middle of the forest. The monster starts running towards him, threatening to attack him. Ryou is paralyzed, not knowing what to do. However, when the creature gets even closer to him, Ryou throws himself to the side on reflex, managing to get rid of the boar's attack. Then, Ryou summons a carpet of ice on the ground that goes towards the boar, making it slide and fall to the ground. At that moment, Ryou notices the monster coming towards him, and then he projects ice spears in the direction the boar is going, and thus he finally manages to kill it. And when he returns home, Ryou studies a little more about the smaller boars, and discovers that this is the weakest species of monster in that world, something that leaves Ryou astonished. astonished, since he had to give everything he had to defeat the creature. And as he reads the book, he finds a page that talks about a certain dragon, which is capable of destroying an entire city without much difficulty. And right below the description of the monster, there is a note warning Ryou to run if he sees one of these dragons. But still on the same note, it is said that it is practically impossible to escape the dragon. Moving on to the next page, Ryou reads about demons, which in this case are a race of unknown origin, so the only thing they can do is pray to never come across a demon. And upon realizing how vast this new world can be, Ryou sighs in frustration, as he realizes that there is still a lot he needs to learn. And well, at another point, Ryou decides to go out for a bit to pick some fruit, when suddenly, he comes face to face with a giant hawk that starts attacking him. But during the fight, Ryou manages to deflect the monster's eye, forcing him to have to retreat from the fight. Seeing the creature in the distance, Ryou falls to the ground, sighing in relief, and notices that his longed-for peaceful life is getting further and further away. And when he gets up, he notices that he has lost track of the house where he was, but he continues on his way, believing he is in the right direction, until suddenly, he comes across a headless warrior in a river, but ignores him and continues on his way. A few days later, Ryou manages to launch a more powerful jet of water, this time, cutting a rock from end to end, and with that, Ryou feels for the first time that he is beginning to get used to how magic works in that world. And when he returns to the headless warrior, Ryou notices that it is a Dullahan, a being that the book does not mention, either because it is not a monster, or because it is not a monster that would be in a beginner's book. And suddenly, the creature begins to attack Ryou with its sword until he falls to the ground exhausted. And although he is unable to defeat the headless warrior, Ryou says he has a purpose in always going to face that being. In this case, he feels that the headless warrior is willing to train him. And suddenly, during the training, Dullahan summons an ice sword and approaches Ryou, as if telling him to master that technique. And suddenly, the Dullahan hands the sword to Ryou and turns his back to leave. And another day, Ryou comes across the killer hawk from the other day again, and although the monster is darker, Ryou can recognize it by the cut it made in the creature's eye. From this, he deduces that the monster has evolved. And suddenly, the monster begins to attack him. In this, Ryou projects 10 ice shield barriers to protect him. However, the monster manages to destroy the barriers one by one, and then Ryou projects his ice spears to try to play against the enemy, but before he could do so, the hawk emits a sharp roar towards the ice, destroying them instantly. In this, Ryou deduces that this power of the monster allows him to annihilate any type of magic, a power that in the hands of a monster makes him totally up. And seeing himself with nothing much to do, Ryou finally decides to use the sword he received from the headless warrior, and then begins to face the monster on equal terms. But in the end, Ryou manages to defeat the hawk, which begins to writhe, showing that he has not accepted his defeat even though he has in fact lost that fight. And even though that monster was his enemy, Ryou believes that he was able to make good use of the encounter they had. After all, he used that fight to mature and become even stronger. Therefore, he thanks the monster for having given him this opportunity to grow. And when reflecting better on that situation, Ryou realizes that the monster evolved only with the intention of taking revenge on him later. Therefore, in respect for the pride that brought the hawk to that battle, Ryou promises to give a worthy end to his opponent. But as soon as he turns to leave, he comes across a dragon, which already scares him. However, Ryou is surprised by the fact that the dragon is able to talk. At this, the dragon asks to see the sword that Ryou carries at his waist, and upon looking at the equipment more closely, the dragon realizes that it is the sword of the king of the fairies, and says that if he received this gift, it is a sign that the king likes him very much. And well, during the conversation, the dragon hears someone calling him, and before leaving, he introduces himself as Lewin, and says that they will soon see them. And in the meantime, the angel who granted Ryou to that world realizes that he ended up making a mistake, letting a secret characteristic pass in Ryou, and this characteristic is precisely eternal youth. When going to the sea to catch some fish, Ryou finds a half-broken boat there, and as he approaches, he discovers a man on the ground, apparently lifeless. But when he looks to the side, Ryou finds another man on the ground, but unlike the other, he is moving. At another point, the man wakes up in a room, surprised to find himself still alive. He goes outside and wonders where he is. As for Ryou, he goes to the young man and is relieved that he's awake. Upon seeing Ryou, the young man is startled, as he couldn't sense the slightest hint of his presence. Furthermore, he notices the boy's modest attire. However, he decides to leave that subject for another time. After all, he must first thank the boy for his help. He introduces himself as Abel, and says he's very grateful to the boy for saving him. As for Ryou, he says he only brought him home, and furthermore, he feels sorry for Abel, as he was the only one who survived the boat accident. Upon hearing this, Abel tells Ryou that he shouldn't worry about those guys. After all, they were smugglers. Upon hearing this, Ryou expresses interest in learning more, but Abel's stomach begins to growl, so they decide to go get something to eat for now. During the meal, Abel asks about the boy's clothes, and Ryou says he has nothing better to wear. After all, he hasn't found any thread or fabric to sew them yet. Abel reminds him that he can simply buy them ready-made, and as he says this, this, Abel remembers that the boy appears to be very humble, so it's clear he wouldn't have enough money to buy his own clothes. Abel feels he's just offended the person who saved his life, and he's apprehensive about this potentially offensive comment. However, Ryou responds normally, saying that the place they're in doesn't even have people or cities, so he has nowhere to buy clothes, leaving him to make do with what he has. Hearing this, Abel deduces that the meat he's eating was obtained by Ryou through hunting, and that, by the way, it was made using the small knife that's right next to him. To this, Ryou explains that he uses the knife more for self-defense or cleaning than for anything else. After all, he uses water magic to hunt and do various other things. Upon seeing this, Abel is amazed by the boy and informs him that even in the central province, a super busy place, only about half of the population is able to use magic, so seeing a boy in such a distant place being able to use magic is something that amazes him a lot. Furthermore, Abel says that he himself is incapable of using magic. As for Ryou, he remembers that Miguel had said that the number of people capable of using magic was actually 20%, not half, but he keeps this information off the record. At this point, Abel remembers something and asks Ryou to go with him to the coast so he can confirm what he just thought. On the way, Abel continues to ponder Ryou's magic and asks if he doesn't need to use a staff. To this, Ryou says he doesn't even have one. Hearing this, Abel deduces that he at least had a staff before, but lost it and was unable to acquire another due to his extreme poverty. Realizing he's just said something stupid, Abel starts to blame himself for making such senseless comments. He tries to correct this mistake by ordering Ryou to stay behind him, promising he'll defend them if any monsters emerge. Upon hearing this, Ryou tells him not to worry, but Abel insists, saying that being protected at all times will hurt his ego. And well, when they reach the slope, they notice that the bodies of the smugglers have all disappeared from this. Ryou deduces that they have been eaten or carried away by the sea. As they talk, Abel notices the boy being formal with him and asks Ryou to stop treating him with such respect. After all, he's the one who was saved there, and so he believes he owes him all that respect. Upon hearing this, Ryou decides to treat him as he asks. Well, after searching the entire boat, Abel says he couldn't find what he was looking for. Ryou asks what he plans to do for now, and Abel says he'll meet his friends in the city of Loon. Hearing that strange name, Ryou says he's never heard of that place, but believes he should head north. With that, Abel thinks a little more, and then invites Ryou to go on this trip with him. But upon hearing this sudden proposal, the boy is confused, but Abel explains things better, and says he's actually hiring Ryou to go on a mission with him. In this case, the boy must help him find Loon, as Abel doesn't even know where he is. And after thinking a little more, Ryou accepts the job offer and offers to be Abel's guide. However, he asks them to leave the next day. After all, Ryou still needs to prepare for this trip. As night falls, Ryou says he's going out to find a certain someone. He then meets the headless swordsman, who informs him that he'll be away from the Rondo forest for a while. He raises his sword and says he'll fight more seriously than usual. After the fight, Ryou prepares to leave, but before he leaves, he receives a cloak from the headless swordsman. The next day, Ryou leaves home, ready to continue his journey. But as he walks a few steps away from the house, Ryou turns to look at his home one last time before leaving. As they delve deeper into the forest, they encounter a giant boar. Abel tells Ryou to step aside, as he will deal with the enemy alone. Ryou takes down the enemy with a single strike using a combat skill. Seeing this, Ryou is impressed and asks what a combat skill is. Hearing this, Abel remembers that mages don't actually use such techniques during combat, and then explains that combat skills are techniques used by sword hinos and other weapon wielders, unlike mages, who use only magic to face their enemies. As they continue on, they encounter the lizard folk. Abel decides to turn around to avoid facing the monsters, but as soon as they turn their backs on the creatures, Ryou notices the lizards approaching. Hearing this, Abel realizes he has no choice but to fight them. As for Ryou, he decides to use his magic to aid in the fight. Seeing that he can cast magic even without a staff, Abel is impressed and asks what spell he just used. Ryou tells him he just cast a spell called Icicle Spear. With that said, Abel calls him to continue their journey. However, Ryou asks him to wait a bit, and so he uses his magic to generate a glass of water. After all, they must always stay hydrated while walking through the forest. And as they continue on, Abel shows the neighborhood a coin from his kingdom, something that impresses Ryou. After all, this is the first time he's seen money in his entire life. Abel explains a little more about money to Ryou, explaining that each nation designs its own coins. And when talking about some kingdoms close, Tobal mentions the name Dabui to Ryou, giving him a strange look. Upon seeing this, Abel asks if something's wrong, and Ryou then says that the name is very cheesy, and since it's the name of a nation, it should have been thought through more carefully. After all, Ryou would never want to say he came from a place called Dabui. And well, moving on, Abel notices the place is devoid of many trees, which gives them a wider view. And suddenly, the rocks in the place begin to be levitated and thrown at them. Seeing this, Abel realizes they're not, in fact, in the middle of the stone golem's nest. He attacks one of the golems, opening a hole in its belly, but the monster quickly regenerates. As for Ryou, he decides to try a different move. He erects a 10-layer ice wall and slams it against the ground. Seeing this, Abel is shocked and asks what the boy just did. Ryou then says he just crushed a man with his 10-layer ice barrier, so he'll use the same tactic with the other golem. With only one golem left, Abel notices that it can't move, and Ryou deduces that they absorb the energy from the ground, but now that it's down, the golems can't do anything. Furthermore, Ryou notices that there's a magic stone attached to the golem, and although he wanted to collect the stones from the other golems as well, Ryou realizes that he's left them in a condition that's practically impossible to collect. Later, they encounter a behemoth, but soon after, a group of wyverns approaches the location. Upon seeing this scene, Abel deduces that behemoth will be easily defeated, but he manages to defeat the group of wyverns with just a roar. Later, Abel and Ryou talk about dungeons, and Ryou expresses a keen interest in visiting them someday. Hearing this, Abel says he's in luck. After all, the only dungeon in the central provinces is in the city they're heading to. And well, at dawn, they continue their journey until suddenly, they sense an enemy presence approaching. A giant bird approaches them and threatens to attack. However, Ryou and Abel throw meat into the sky, distracting the bird and causing it to fly away. And although they manage to survive easily, Abel says that the monster from before had a very powerful and imposing presence. And as for Ryou, he assures that in a battle against the monster, they would have been killed. After all, humans were not meant to fight enemies of that size. And as for that place, Abel says that there are rumors of strange things happening there, as there have been many sightings of behemoth and other dangerous monsters in the area. As for Ryou, he suggests that the wyverns from before came from the north, and so they encounter the creatures there. Upon seeing them, Ryou says they'll need to fight. After all, even though they're very strong, there's no way to prevent that confrontation from occurring. Ryou freezes the enemies to the ground using his ice magic, and then Abel collects the magic stone the monster dropped and says he's surprised at how easily they defeated a wyvern. However, reinforcements from the monsters arrive shortly afterward to confront them. And upon discovering how to take down wyverns, Ryou suggests they want to have more fun with these creatures, but Abel puts the brakes on him, saying it's best to never encounter any of these monsters, even if they know how to take them down. As they head north, Abel wonders where they are. Ryou deduces they're in the Debui Empire, but Abel explains that the Debui Empire is actually located in the north of the kingdom, so it's unlikely they've arrived there yet. Upon hearing this, Ryou still seems to be struggling with the kingdom's peculiar name, as he's relieved they're not in Debui. Hearing this, Abel is at a loss to understand Ryou's enmity toward the kingdom, especially for the reason he's already mentioned. The boy then says that Abel has it all wrong because he doesn't hate the Debui Empire, as Abel thinks, in fact, he just dislikes the name. Well, with that said, Ryou notices a road ahead of them, which appears to lead from east to west. Upon discovering this, Abel notices some familiar mountains behind him, and then says that if they continue along that road, they will reach a city called Keilati. Hearing this, Ryou is relieved, as he will finally be able to rest in a city after so long. At this, Abel notices the boy's mood change very quickly, as just seconds ago, he was eager to go after and kill more wyverns. Seeing Abel trying to catch him in a contradiction, Ryou makes it clear that he intends to do both, each in its own time. As for Abel, he only agrees with Ryou's version of wanting to relax. After all, Abel is already tired of adventures for now. Besides, he says the food in Keilati is really good, so he advises Ryou to stop thinking about battles for a bit and try the local cuisine. Well, moving on, they find a tavern and decide to stop for a bite to eat. Abel begins to talk to Ryou about these adventurers' guilds, who in turn becomes curious about the subject. Abel suggests that the boy join a guild as soon as possible, as a guild card can even serve as his ID, which in turn will save them from having to pay taxes when they go sightseeing in other cities. Having said that, Abel reminds him that he acted as Ryou's guarantor, paying him a silver. Hearing this, the boy becomes suspicious and deduces that Abel did this as a way to collect something from him later, such as demanding slave labor from Ryou. However, Abel makes it clear that he's not the jerk Ryou paints him as. Upon hearing this, the boy apologizes for having suspected something of that nature about him. As for Abel, he goes on to explain a bit more about how adventurers' guilds work, saying that the guild is responsible for purchasing magic stones and materials from monsters at a high price. While they talk, a local employee brings them their food, which in this case is curry, the famous dish from Reincarnation stories. Ryou then remembers that the protagonist of an isekai of this type usually travels a long way before finally being able to recreate that dish. However, seeing that it already exists in Phi leaves Ryou speechless, and after finishing the first plate of curry, Ryou asks the waitress for another round, and then he asks Abel if they have curry and loom too, and Abel in turn answers yes, and says he was happy to see that Ryou liked the dish. Well, the next day, the boy continues talking about the curry, saying it was fantastic. At this, Abel is incredulous that he liked the food so much. And as for Ryou, he asks Abel not to hide any more delicious dishes that exist in that city. Therefore, Ryou starts asking Abel to tell him the best desserts in the city. However, Abel continues on his way and says that he will take care of that matter later. And well, as they continue on their way, they arrive in Lune, Abel's hometown. On the way to the guild, Abel explains to Ryou how guild rankings work, saying that Ryou will start at rank F, the lowest rank. Once they arrive at the guild, everyone is shocked to see Abel alive, as he had been missing for several days. As for Ryou, he notices Abel crowded with people, so he decides to go outside so as not to disturb their moment among friends. However, as he walks through town, Ryou bumps into a random elf who, upon seeing him, tells him that the outfit he's wearing once belonged to the Fairy King. Hearing this, Ryou is speechless, but the elf says she was just wandering around in his clothes and says the Fairy King must be very fond of him since he gave her one of his cloaks. With that, the elf apologizes for not being able to speak properly as she's in a hurry. As for Ryou, he continues to stare at her, not understanding anything she's saying. Suddenly, Abel goes outside and finds Ryou to introduce him to his friends. He explains the whole story he had with Ryou, from when the boy saved him to the moment he returned to Lune. Abel asks his friends to treat Ryou well, too. After all, he'll be registering with that guild as an adventurer. At another point, Abel takes Ryou to the reception to register with the guild, and asks that the boy be registered at level D as his endorsement. Upon hearing this, the receptionist is surprised, as no one from the Scarlet Sword has ever endorsed another person in this way. However, Abel says the boy is truly valuable and therefore worthy of working with him. But before officially making Ryou Abel's endorsement, the girl reminds him that Ryou will need to pass some tests to determine the boy's strength level. Upon hearing this, Abel says he was waiting for the guild master to talk about this and a few other things. Seeing that he intends to speak with the master, the girl asks Abel to wait until she goes to get him. After a few minutes, Abel finally comes face to face with the master after so long. Before getting to the main topic, Abel apologizes for having worried everyone about his disappearance. As for the master, he says he had already assumed the worst from the start when he learned of his disappearance. With that said, he notices Ryou's presence and asks who that boy is. Abel introduces him as the man who saved his life, and upon discovering this, the guild master formally introduces himself to the boy, claiming to be Huma Glass, and then thanks Ryou for saving Abel's life. Upon hearing this, Roy again tries to play it down, saying he was simply in the right place at the right time, and therefore believes he's not worthy of all this credit. Moving on to the main topic of the meeting, Abel says he was considering registering Roy as his endorsement, but upon hearing this, Hugh says the boy will still need to pass a test to certify his level. At this, Abel reassures him, saying that the boy is actually even stronger than he is. With this, Abel throws on the table some of the magic stones they collected on the way to Lune. Upon seeing them, Hugh recognizes that they are wind elemental magic stones, but he can't analyze anything beyond that. But upon further thought, Hugh realizes that those stones are from wyverns, and noticing that they have an absurd amount of stones. Hugh says that to achieve all that, they would have Tothan having defeated an entire army of these monsters, something that is humanly impossible, even more so for two adventurers. As for Abel, he says these wyverns were hunted south of the Evil Mountains, a place adventurers usually avoid, as most who set foot there never returned alive, since Abel and Ryou managed to return from that place. Abel believes this is more than enough proof of the boy's strength, and as for Hugh, he accepts this evidence as proof. And well, during the meeting, the room is invaded by other friends of Abel who come to see him. Just then, Roy is taken to the records room, where he is approached by Nina, who begins asking him a series of questions. And upon hearing about the dungeons during the interview, Roy asks Nina to put his name on the next course the teams will take in one of Lune's dungeons. And well, upon completing the registration, Nina hands Roy a card and then leaves the room. Meanwhile, Hugh feels as if a weight has been lifted from his shoulders. Now that Abel is back, the morbid atmosphere that had gripped the guild has completely disappeared. So, he decides to spread the word that Abel is alive. As for Roy, he's taken to the place where he'll receive his first payment for escorting Abel around the city. Abel also says he intends to buy Roy new clothes and a staff. However, upon hearing this expression, the boy, unsure of what exactly a staff is, explains that it's the item mages typically use to cast magic. But upon hearing this, Roy says he's never needed any accessories to cast his spells. After all, the only accessory he uses is his sword when he needs to face an enemy at close range. However, looking the boy over, Abel notices he doesn't have a sword. However, Roy shows him his blade, which in this case is just a small knife, which to Abel can't be considered a sword. At another point, Roy finds himself walking alone through the city, and when he stops to think about the coincidences between that world and Earth, Roy refuses to believe that all these signs are just coincidences. And well, as night falls, Ryou, Abel, and some other friends celebrate his return to Lune by getting drunk. The next day, Nina accompanies Ryou to his room. Upon arriving, they encounter some more boys. Nina introduces Ryou to them, and the boys introduce themselves as Nils and Edo. As soon as Nina leaves, Nils reveals his crush on her. However, Edo reminds him that the guild receptionists are full of suitors, so he advises Nils to give up on her. Suddenly, Nina returns to the room to bring another adventurer. The boy introduces himself as Amon. Meanwhile, Abel talks to his friends and tells them everything Roy did during the fight against the wyverns. However, Linz is skeptical, as the only one capable of doing everything Abel is describing is the Infernal Mage, a mage who was able to burn 1,000 Imperial soldiers with a single magical attack. As for one of the girls, she begins to worry that Roy might side with the Empire at some point, but Abel assures her that this will never happen. After all, Roy has already said the Empire's name. And after spending 5 days studying, Ryou and the other students finally learn all about dungeon exploration. So the teacher informs them that they will enter the first layer of a real dungeon later. That afternoon, hearing this, Ryou smiles with joy, as he felt it was taking a while for him to finally experience a real dungeon. But as for Amon, Ryou notices her a little tense about the situation, and tells her it's too early to be nervous about the dungeon, as worrying now will only tire her out later. And even though she knows this, Amon still can't control himself. Meanwhile, the teacher calls the students' attention to him and says that before they leave, he will answer any questions they have. At this, Ryou raises his hand and asks if there's any way to go straight to a layer he's already passed. Hearing the boy's question, the teacher is surprised that he knows this even without having set foot in a dungeon before. He then replies that there are dungeons with such a mechanism in the southern provinces, but he won't find anything like it in the Loon dungeon. And since he's only heard rumors about it, the professor won't be able to say in detail what's really in this southern dungeon. And even without having his question fully answered, Ryou feels satisfied with the professor's answer. As for Amon, she doesn't understand what he meant by going straight to the dungeon lair he was in before after all. She didn't know anything like that existed either. As for him, Ryou says he'd only heard about it, but he doesn't understand much about it either. And well, upon arriving at the dungeon, the professor reinforces what he'd already taught the students, saying that every few years, the dungeon's monsters have been multiplying rapidly in a phenomenon known as the roar of the deep. And often, the monsters that emerge during this period, they reach the surface. So they built double walls around the city, precisely to prevent the invasion of these uncontrolled monsters. And as she listens to the professor's explanation, Amon becomes even more tense, and says that just the name Roar of the Deep is enough to scare her. Upon hearing this, the professor reminds her that this is a phenomenon that occurs once every few years, so they needn't worry about it happening out of nowhere, as it's very unlikely to happen now. Along the way, Ryou tries to calm Amon down again, telling her she really needs to relax. And well, upon reaching the first layer of the dungeon, the teacher reminds the newcomers that there are no monsters there, so they can explore the environment as they please without worrying about anything. However, he asks the students not to stray too far from the entrance. But as they blast through the dungeon, Ryou and Amon sense a presence coming from a dark area of the dungeon, but Ryou says the monster is a good distance away. With that said, Ryou decides to paralyze the creature with his magic, and asks Amon to attack him as soon as he does. Suddenly, the enemy they sensed appears. Ryou recognizes the creature as a soldier ant, a monster from the beginner's guide he's already read. According to the book, Ryou says the simplest way to deal with the creature is by attacking the base of its neck. Having explained this, Ryou paralyzes the monster with his magic, and orders Amon to continue the rest of the work. And after they defeat the first enemy off dungeon, Ryou takes the magic stone from the soldier ant and leaves the place. And to celebrate their first trip to a dungeon, the professor takes all the newbies to a tavern to drink and socialize. Edo then praises Ryou and Amon for defeating a soldier ant on their first dungeon run. However, Amon says that he actually only landed the final blow, so he gives Ryou all the credit. Hearing him be so humble, Ryou says they only won because Amon managed to land a clean hit. So he tells Ryou not to be so modest when talking about himself. Upon hearing this, Nils says they managed to get the magic stone, and for him, that's all that matters in the end. With that said, he asks what they plan to do the next day, and Amon says he'll return to the dungeon, but he still feels unsure about going alone. Upon hearing this, Ryou invites him to go down to the dungeon with him. After all, Ryou is planning on reaching the third layer. Speaking of the dungeon's layers, Ryou says he found it strange that the soldier ant appeared in the first layer. After all, it's not a natural occurrence in such an initial layer. Upon hearing this, Nils confirms Ryou's statement, informing him that the first layer of every dungeon usually has only bats and nothing else. As for Edo, he says he's only been hearing reports of soldier ant sightings in the first and second layers in the last few months. Abel explains that soldier ants can hunt tunnels down to the first layer, thus explaining why they are there even without power. Having said this, Abel introduces himself to Ryou's friends and says that the boy, despite being strong and kind, has serious personality issues. So Abel asks them to be understanding with Ryou. Hearing this, Ryou deduces that Abel is trying to incite an unnecessary fight between him and his group. Upon realizing that Abel is one of the Scarlet Sword group, everyone is astonished. Nils introduces himself as a simple F-rank swordsman who arrived in Loon. He then completely demeans himself, saying that the true hero there is Abel himself, and thus asks for the honor of shaking his hand. Upon hearing this, Abel shakes his hand but asks the boy to stop exaggerating. With that, Nils promises to do his best from now on, and without exaggerating, as he just did. As for Ryou, he asked what Abel is doing there so late at night. Abel explains that the mission he and his group accepted will take longer than expected, so they've decided to return to the city and set off on the mission closer to the scheduled date. During their conversation, Lin and Rhea show up and take Abel to the guild to register their return. And well, the next day, Amon and Ryou set off for the dungeon after the fight ends. Ryou tells Amon that his swordsmanship reminds him a lot of Abel. Upon hearing this, Amon explains that his fighting style is the Hume style, a form of fighting that originated in the royal capital. During the conversation, Ryou says he traveled with Abel to many places and always saw him practicing his form early in the morning, because even though he's a prodigy with a good sword, even he needs to maintain discipline. Another day, Ryou wakes up, but this time he goes to the library instead of the dungeon, and then Ryou buys some basic books to improve his general knowledge. Leaving the library, Ryou returns to walking the streets, until suddenly, he comes across an eclipse occurring at that very moment. And to make matters worse, Ryou notices the world around you becoming different and scarier. Suddenly, a demon girl arrives and notices Ryou nearby, deciding to launch an attack. As for Ryou, he realizes that the being is as powerful as Being Griffin, so he feels the best course of action would be to flee. But before he can do anything, Ryou is attacked by the girl, and he defends himself by reinforcing his ice barrier. Seeing that Ryou has managed to protect himself from her attacks, the demon girl is visibly surprised, but upon realizing that Ryou is wearing the Fairy King's robe, she begins to understand who she is dealing with. Still, she makes it clear that she will tear Ryou in half regardless of who he is. During the fight, Ryou finds his opponent's speed strange, due to his own rapidity, and deduces that she is using wind magic to increase his speed. However, Ryou can keep up with the demon's high speed, and believes that if he remains on the defensive, the demon won't be able to kill him so easily. Furthermore, Ryou notices that the girl's attacks aren't as effective as his master's. With that said, Ryou strikes the fire magic in the demon girl's hand before she can fire it. Seeing the boy shooting magic so quickly, the demon calls him a monster, and as for Ryou, he attacks his enemy with all his might. During the fight, he notices the girl's wounds healing faster than he can hurt her. A few more minutes into the fight, the demon girl realizes that her time to fight Ryou is finally up, and for now, she decides it's best to leave. As for him, Ryou tells him she was already taking her time, as he wanted her to leave much earlier. Hearing this, the demon girl is disappointed in him, as she thought Ryou was enjoying the fight just as much as she was. During the conversation, the demon introduces itself as Leonor Raka Albuquerque, and then leaves but says they will fight again. After all, the boy's enormous strength has caught her attention, and will certainly attract the attention of other demons like her. With that said, she asks that he not be killed by any other demon, as Leonor wants him killed by her hands. And she makes it clear that she will be even stronger when they meet again. And well, after finally getting rid of the demons, Ryou decides to return to the library and buy some more books. Meanwhile, Edo and the others are ambushed by a group of adventurers. Edo complains to the boys, saying they had the upper hand by ambushing them. Hearing this, the group leader reminds him that monsters in a dungeon don't usually warn when they're going to attack, so they should be more alert when the enemy approaches. Suddenly, Ryou appears on the scene and takes down all the troublemakers, then reminds the group leader that they should also be careful not to be attacked by surprise. With that said, Ryou asks if the boy will run away with his tail between his paws now that his team has been eliminated. Hearing this provocation, the boy decides to try to attack Ryou, so he can have some semblance of dignity in the face of what just happened. However, he ends up getting the worst of it, taking a punch to the stomach. After leaving the place, they all go to a hot springs bath, and there Ryou partially tells them what happened to him, but hides the part about fighting a demon. After the fight, Amon is healed by basic healing magic. Edo then tells Nils about the goblin archers on the 5th layer, something he finds very strange, as these monsters shouldn't be there. As for Nils, he decides to call it a day and return to the surface immediately. Hearing this, Amon is surprised, as he thought they would stay in the dungeon longer, but seeing him so excited, Nils advises him not to overdo it. After all, he cares only about the team's survival, and anything after that is a bonus. The next day, Ryou remembers Leonor's magic he witnessed the night before. While her power is indeed unbeatable, in terms of casting speed, Ryou believes they are on par. Therefore, he decides to focus on strengthening his weaknesses. After all, that's the only thing he needs to become a more powerful adventurer. Remembering Leonor's instantaneous approach, Ryou deduces it's wind magic, and then becomes envious of her magic. But then, he realizes there's no point in envying something he can't have. Therefore, he should think of a similar ability that uses water magic. And when he thinks about it briefly, the first ability that comes to mind is the water jet, which in this case is an ability he's already used underwater to emerge. But he hasn't yet tested it on land. In this, Ryou creates an ice corridor with his water magic, and then projects several jets of water directly behind his back, intending to push him under the ice corridor to gain speed. Thus, he believes he can copy Leonor's instantaneous approach ability. However, Ryou ends up failing in his attempt to do so, and so, he gives up trying to replicate this ability. Instead, Ryou decides to go to the library to learn more about demons and alchemy. Meanwhile, Lin picks up some forbidden spellbooks, but doesn't find what she's looking for. She was looking for a spell capable of conjuring a thick wall of ice in the air, or even strong ice spears to pierce a wyvern's defenses. As expected, she finds nothing. From this, Lin deduces that these types of spells she's looking for, if they exist, are original spells, so they won't be in a simple forbidden spellbook. Suddenly, Lin is interrupted by Syrah, who comes to check on her after a long time. Seeing Lin leafing through several books looking for something, Syrah finds Lin's behavior strange, as she's not usually that studious. Lin explains that she was just researching something, but in the end, she found no information about it. During the conversation, Lin remembers that Syrah was away from Lune at the request of the royal capital, and then comments on her trip. At this, Syrah says she needs to go out on business again, so she says goodbye to Lin and turns to leave. Meanwhile, Nils and the others return to the guild and are greeted by Nina, who is surprised to see them back early. Edo then tells them they have a good reason for their sudden return. They found a mysterious magic stone, which they suspect is the goblin archer's magic stone. Upon seeing that stone, Nina confirms her suspicions of the group, but says that these stones have not appeared in the 5th layer for years. Upon hearing this, Edo says she was already aware of the stone's rarity, and so they decided to return to the guild quickly, as she wanted to inform everyone about this find. With that, Nina collects the stone and quickly goes to the guild master to update him. But first, Nina thanks Nils and the others for their concern in informing them about the stone. And upon learning about the matter, the guild master also finds it strange that there are goblin archers on the 5th layer of the dungeon and believes this could be a warning sign. He then asks Nina to summon the Scarlet Sword and the White Brigade, as he has an offer to make to both groups. Upon learning of the summons, Abel complains the entire way about the White Brigade's presence. However, when he comes face to face with Phelps and his group, Abel maintains his composure. As for the guild master, he thanks both groups for their presence in his office. Then, the master briefly recaps what Nina had told him about the incident involving the goblin archers on the 5th layer of the dungeon. After hearing all the information, Abel asks how certain the information is. To this, the master claims to be 100% certain. After all, the adventurers who defeated the goblin archer returned to the guild with the monster's magic stone. Having confirmed the situation, the master orders the Scarlet Sword and White Brigade groups to enter the dungeon to investigate the incident and check for signs of the roar from the depths. In this case, this phenomenon occurs due to the explosive growth of the monster population. However, it's an event that usually occurs over years, as the last roar from the deep occurred about 10 years ago. This means they may be close to a new one. After all, the appearance of goblin archers on the 5th layer is a very strong sign of this. The guild master says he's willing to pay 100 gold coins upfront and an additional 100 after completing the quest, which in this case consists of simply checking the dungeon's status regarding this phenomenon. And as soon as they leave the place, they will set up shop in the double walls in a joint operation between the guild and the knights. Upon hearing this, Abel is astonished by the master's concern about this matter and says that his preparations are exaggeratedly advanced, almost as if he were certain the phenomenon would occur. Upon hearing this, the master reminds him that the roar of the depths is not something to be trifled with, so if they encounter this phenomenon, any preparation is welcome. Therefore, they should go to the dungeon the next morning. After hearing everything the master had to say, both groups agree to participate in the mission he gave them. The next morning, Ryou gets up early to go to the northern library, still intent on learning more about alchemy and demons. Upon hearing this, Amon tells him there's a forbidden section in the northern library, but only adventurers of rank B or higher can access this area. While this may be discouraging, Nils assures him that Ryou will soon be qualified. Upon arriving, Ryou notices that the southern library is larger than the former, but the atmosphere in the northern library feels very different. And when thinking about asking an attendant, were they rereading the books about demons, Ryou realizes he would be seen as crazy if he did so. And once in the dungeon, all the adventurers from both groups arrive, ready to begin their quest. But before they open the dungeon door, Abel senses something strange coming from inside. And so he asks Lin to use her spell to look at the first layer of the dungeon. And as she does so, Lin notices the presence of dozens of monsters, suggesting that the phenomenon of the Rudigo of the depths is already at work. Then, the master orders everyone to retreat and accuse the knights and the guild of what they've just discovered. Meanwhile, Ryou is approached by Sira in the library, and she says she already had a feeling she'd see him again. With that, she asks what he's looking for there. He considers asking about the books on demons, but ends up letting it slide and instead asks where the books on alchemy are, as his ultimate goal is to create a golem with the knowledge he gains from them. Hearing this, Sira asks him to accompany her, as she knows absolutely everything in that library. Eka then leads him to a shelf where the books he seeks are located. Meanwhile, the guild master and the two groups wait for the goblins to leave the dungeon and then begin their attack to keep the north side as safe as possible. During the combat, the guild master notices that even with the knight's help, the fight is still not going very well for them. After all, there are more goblins leaving the dungeon than there are fighters outside to stop them. The guild master notes that this time, the goblins are in even greater numbers. Little by little, Abel and his team run out of arrows to fight, but the other adventurers bring more arrows, which they have scavenged from all the weapons stores in the city. And furthermore, he says he received a message from the guild master, who believes there's something even bigger waiting for them behind the goblin horde. However, this creature will be left for the Scarlet Sword to face, so Abel must be on standby. Upon receiving this information, Abel asks Nils to let the guild master know he's already heard the message, and suddenly, they notice a deafening silence on the spot and the goblins ceasing combat, and then they deduce that the ferocious monster is about to appear. At this, the guild master orders the Scarlet Sword and the White Brigade to descend from the wall and attack. As they descend to the combat site, they are surprised by a goblin general, although the creature appears to be the monster that was supposed to appear. Abel tells them to remain calm and wait a bit. Just then, two other goblin generals arrive, meaning a king is behind them. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Abel and Phelps decide to take one goblin general each, leaving the third for Rhea and Shenna to deal with. But before the combat, Abel warns everyone that they must eliminate the goblin generals immediately, because if the king appears before then, they will have serious problems to deal with. And right at the start of the fight, the goblin king launches launches an air blast at them, killing his 3 generals before they can even fight, as the king's plan was to kill them along with his generals from the start. However, Abel and the others manage to evade the attack, and then begin attacking the Goblin King together. Meanwhile, the Guildmaster stands from afar watching the fight, hoping they can defeat the Goblin King. After all, he's counting only on Scarlet's sword and the White Brigade to finish that thing off. Abel then pierces the Goblin King to distract him, and then Lin hits the enemy with the Hail of Fire ability, instantly defeating the Goblin King. This is too good to be true. They didn't call the protagonist. They didn't suffer. They didn't fall to the ground and get beaten. There's something strange there. Leave a like and subscribe if you want the sequel, which I bring to you. I went.